afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us once again. This is yet another episode of the California Proprietarian Podcast, otherwise known as CA Propcast, as we like to call it, where we discuss all sorts of issues from across the spectrum of what's going on in the United States today and throughout the world in some cases that have implications for our private property rights, which are natural rights granted to us by God. So we want to discuss all kinds of ways we can protect those rights from being violated, because we know there's all sorts of tyrannical forces, both public and private, in this country that are trying to deprive us of those rights. And so we like to analyze those threats on this show in any way we can in order to discern the best method for combating those threats. And to discuss a component of that today, I brought on a very good friend of mine from our days at Pepperdine University, Logan Guleff. And with that, I will kick it over to Logan to kind of introduce himself, talk about, his resume and his background and qualifications and, what brought him to this point. And after that, we'll get into the meat of it, as always. So, Logan, I'll kick it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Philip. Thank you for having me on your podcast today.
Absolutely.
It's an honor to be here. And
it's a pleasure.
Congratulations. I'm a pretty good friend of Philip. We had our classes together at Pepperdine, and I'm a student. I'm also a kind of a bit of a chef, I like to call myself. But yeah, I certainly have kind of my thumb on the pulse of kind of that whole culture within Pepperdine and kind of higher education as a whole. As a student, I go to quite a few little parties and get-togethers, and I know some of the UCLA kids, and I know a couple of the USC kids, and I feel like this is going to be a great episode.
I couldn't agree more. And Logan, if you're willing, would you be able to go into just a little bit your background as a chef, and specifically some of the experience you've had with I think it was reality TV, if I'm not mistaken?
Oh yeah, of course, Philip. I did win Master Chef Junior season 2, and I do have some experience in the entertainment industry and kind of everything that goes into creating media, creating content, things like that. I did work as an influencer, private chef. I've done a lot of things, a kind of umbrella term for all that. But yeah, I had a great time with it, and I still enjoy doing it. And now I study economics, and I enjoy that a lot. I enjoy looking at the markets and looking at how that affects things, and food costs and all that. I find it to be pretty fascinating. But yeah, that's a brief intro onto me. I'm a pretty happy guy. You can call me a fun guy if you want.
Excellent.
Big fan of mushrooms, but
yes,
take
that
wherever you want.
Yes, the deliberate strategic ambiguity there. I always love that. But now you mentioned that you're an economics major, and so I would imagine that since you study market behavior and you study the system we're living in, the correct technical term for it would be neoliberal capitalism. So you study supply and demand, I'm sure, and so it must aggravate you to no end, I would assume, to hear people on the far left promoting either communism or doctrines that are similar to it, revolutionary socialism, democratic socialism, social democracy, because I'm sure that your education as an economist has taught you that these systems will inevitably fail. Because they do not respond to the demand forces that are inherent in a market that are necessary to regulate an economy properly and supply everybody's needs where possible. So could you maybe explore that just a little bit?
Yeah, of course. One of the things is, when you study the market and you study how supply and demand works, it's way easier to take a demand-focused approach in the market, and that's why it's called a market, because people go out and they shop. They individually make choices as to what they prefer, what they like, what's worth their money, and what properly meets their indifference curve, and what is providing them the best marginal benefit for their marginal cost. And that's kind of a staple of looking at the whole field of economics. And then when you try to take more of a supply side approach, you encounter a lot of inefficiencies kind of overall. And it's those inefficiencies that are pretty aggravating, especially when you can graphically, point them out as right there. That is the amount of social good or net good that we are losing by imposing, a price floor or a price ceiling or a tariff or a tax or a subsidy. Anytime that you as an outside entity are trying to impact the market, it's going to have an effect, and odds of it being less efficient are really high because it's hard to look at somebody and say, I know how to spend your money better than you do.
Right, and
And
it,
that's the
it
end of the day.
it's also a very arrogant thing to assert, that you know how to spend somebody's money better than they do, and then to bring the force of the state to bear to compel them to comply with your vision as opposed to their own. So I couldn't agree more. Now I have to ask, in your experience being on Pepperdine's campus, and I've got my own lens to look at this through here, of course, but do most of the leftist or left-leaning people you encounter on campus, do they tend to focus more on class conflict, or do they tend to focus more on conflicts based on race and gender?
I would say it's much more of a race and gender kind of bias to it. At least that's what I've seen. The
I
class
agree.
kind of that classical, I guess you could say kind of Marxist view of, conflict of the classes with the proletariat and the bourgeoisie and all that goes into that. That's kind of a little bit more old fashioned and kind of, I hate to say it, but out of style in a lot of higher education, taking a more kind of individualist approach to those kind of issues of, equity, inclusivity. Those kind of are the buzzwords, and less focused as more of a collective. It's much more of this is you as an individual, and these are your attributes that make you different or special. And then that's why you should be receiving blank, blank, blank,
Mm,
and special treatment. And less of like, well, there's this whole group of people who are impoverished and we want to change that. Or there's this whole issue that's a whole group and we need to change that, whether that be, unions or whatever. There's many different ways to cut up a pie, as you could say. So that's kind of what I've experienced. But a lot of Pepperdine's economic faculty are pretty right leaning. They maintain that way because they're a lot older. A lot of our professors, are very old and very tenured and come from a older time. A lot of the newer professors are more in the other sciences, the other social sciences, the sociology, the psychology,
right.
those kinds of classes. I find definitely take more of that approach. But most of my economics classes are very market oriented.
Now, when you say market oriented, and of course, obviously, I've met a lot of these economics professors you're talking about, and broadly speaking, they're supportive of capitalism. But don't they also kind of have a tendency to support, things like NAFTA, things like TPP, like the so-called free trade agreements that I think a lot of populists, both left and right-wing populists, would contend have siphoned away a lot of blue-collar jobs from ordinary Americans and caused a lot of, unemployment and widespread suffering in this country.
Yeah, that's certainly one way to look at it. The department as a whole is quite free trade oriented. I mean, I just got out of international trade and finance, and so it does make sense. But the other thing to look at is, when you're imposing these tariffs, when you're imposing these protectionist policies, it's very hard to maintain wealth and then maintain the growth of wealth. And it's much easier to look at it not as a losing of these jobs, which I mean, there certainly are,
Mm-hmm.
but to look at it as more of an evolution of the American economy into a more service-based economy, a less goods-based economy, something where the investment in the self and the individual is much more important. It's much less, oh, you're going to stand here and make all these like little widgets, and much more of, you're going to go work on an oil field, you're going to be exported, you're going to sell skills, you're going to sell, data science. It's much more of an evolution of the economy, which I think is something that people always kind of get a little mixed up because they think, oh, there's just all the manufacturing is just leaving. But they don't realize that, it's leaving because, it's not economically feasible. And if you want a higher paying job, that's not going to be a manufacturing job. That's going to be a service job, an information job, a technical job, something where you're designing something where you're higher up in the food chain. I mean, I think you can ask anyone, would you rather be a designer or would you rather be a guy making it on the floor? And I'm going to say 10 times out of 10, you'd rather be a designer drawing up
Yes.
the blueprints, drawing up the schematics than being the guy putting the damn thing together. So That's at least one of the things that I've kind of come across and learned from all my economic readings and research and videos. Um, and kind of an interesting distinction to make because it's very easy to get into this protectionist point where you're like, oh, we gotta maintain manufacturing, and to a certain extent, that's true for for defense, for just self sustainability, for those kind of things. Yes, it totally makes sense to try to incentivize those industries, but those should be incentivized through more subsidies and through other ways than like just putting a flat tariff on it, because that's just kind of something else. And if these lower quality goods are coming in and they're not as good quality, then obviously they would be outcompeted by higher quality goods,
Mhm.
and to let the market and the individual decide.
And I like that individual choice component, certainly. Now, the other angle of this that I have to ask about and would like to explore a little bit is,
Of
I think
course.
you and I, broadly speaking, we probably mostly agree with Donald Trump's positions on the social and culture war issues for the most part. Maybe with some variation. He leaves some to be desired there. But so I take it, broadly speaking, you probably don't agree very much with his proposed economic policies.
With his economic policies, I feel like there's a lot of nuance to each individual point, and I feel like he's also appealing to a base, and that base wants a very specific thing, and it's hard to argue with that. It's very hard to argue with American made. I prefer American made. I love
Hmm.
American made.
Me too.
I look for it. I like it. I'm sleeping on an American made mattress right
Hmm.
now, made down here in the South, and I absolutely love it. And but with that comes the greater cost of American made, and I feel like for to a certain extent, it's not that all economic policy is bad. It's just about having enough moderation so that it stays together. I think that that's another thing that everybody thinks, oh, it's going to be optimized, it's going to be perfect. There's no perfect policy out there, in my opinion. I think there's trade offs to everything. There's certainly trade offs to a totally market based approach, and free trade, free everything. And there's trade offs to a more protectionist based kind of approach. But I feel like certainly for Americans and your average constituent, that looking at kind of the 4 years of his last presidency, you can say that they were good years. The inflation was under
Yes,
control, and
that's true.
and I can tell you personally, I was prosperous for those 4 years, and I was pretty happy. So that being said, I'm not going to say that his policies are bad or that they're not going to work, or they're going to have this. They're going to have some cons, of course, but I think largely as a whole, I think he's demonstrated that they're pretty effective, and they're effective at garnering a large base and people who
Yes.
want to support that.
Yep. That's
And that's what matters, at the end of the
that's
day.
certainly true. And now, if I may,
Of course.
to get back to something we discussed earlier a little bit when we were talking about how sort of the old left tended to focus on class conflict, along classical Marxist lines, whereas the modern left, like I would say, starting in maybe a little bit in the 1970s, but really kicking into high gear in the late 80s and certainly by the mid 90s, they've tended to prioritize conflicts of race and gender. Certainly in the United States and Western Europe, over other kinds of intra-society social conflict. So I'm curious. My theory about what caused that shift is that most of it was caused by the downfall of the Soviet Union, how it just kind of broke in on itself, just broke under its own weight, and also to a lesser extent from the abject failure of Mao's Cultural Revolution and his replacement by the relatively moderate and pragmatic Deng Xiaoping. Do you have any theories, as somebody who, and I was a history major, so that's how I developed those theories. As an economics major, do you have anything you could add to that, or do you think I'm wrong, in that supposition? Like, if you could just give your angle on what you think caused that paradigm shift on the Western left.
Of course, of course. Having visited China twice, and being very intimately aware of the culture and aware of how Mao was, and studying it a fair bit, I would say that shifting that was kind of a natural progression. It's hard to say that we should be fighting along a class distinction when your two biggest examples implode and fall apart, and have very severe consequences. Lots of death, lots of starvation, lots of bad things, and it's hard to say, well, we should be like that. And then you look at that, and you're like, whoa. whoa, I don't want to be sent to a gulag. I don't want to have no food in my grocery store. I don't want to have these policies. I don't want to be stuck in this position. And I think it's very evident to see that from how various other parts of the world developed in that post World War II phase, where I feel like everything really got rolling with the Marshall Plan, with Japan
Mhm.
being reconstructed. If you look at how those countries have done compared to your Eastern Bloc countries, compared to your other areas of communism, I guess you could say, your Venezuela, your Vietnam, your all those kind of countries, even China to an extent. You could
Cuba,
say,
North
well,
Korea.
oh,
Yep.
Cuba's a great example as
Yep.
well. Thank you for that one.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
and North Korea maybe most prominently, I would
oh,
say.
how could I? I forgot North Korea.
No, no, it's
Yeah,
quite all right.
but you can see there, it's hard to say that you want to live like that,
Right.
and I think that that's one of the stories that I think back from during the Cold War is I believe it was Gorbachev came and visited the U.S. and he was touring around. I think it was Texas, and he wanted to stop at a grocery store. And so he made this stop at this grocery store. It was completely unplanned. And he made sure it was unplanned because Gorbachev wanted to see, like, well, what is it really like? So I'm going to ambush him. I'm going to have him take me to this grocery store. I'm going to see what's going on. And he goes there and he sees just American exceptionalism, just front and center, meat, eggs, food, just a bajillion choices, and once you see that, it's hard to say, well, I want to keep going with this. And that's I think one of the things that kind of led to kind of a collapse within a lot of those class distinction based socialist communist countries. It's hard to look at that and be like waking up every day to the same little weedy biscuit and
That's right.
this is delicious when I could be having you know bacon, sausage, eggs,
The
toast, the
best
whole
burgers.
works,
Yep.
an amazing breakfast, and you're waking up to cereal in a commie block. And
And
I mean,
borscht.
not that there's anything bad with a commie block, but I've got a front lawn. I live in a house,
Yep.
and I'm very happy. And I think that that's something that was lacking in those countries to me is there's no American dream. There was no dream to aspire to except one of corruption, I believe, where you're trying to graft off whatever you can to sell, which again to sell
Or, or
and
or
bring
try
to
to
a
be
market.
or try to become a high-ranking commissar in the party apparatus. So that
Exactly. I
uh,
mean,
that
but there's
that'll
no
get
there's
you
no
ahead.
clear there's no clear route to that like there is in the U.S. where you could say, oh well, I'm going to go to education, or I'm going to serve in the military, and then I'm going to
Right.
get education for free, and then there's a lot of routes to improving your life. There's a lot of class mobility, and I feel like that's something that kind of became an issue as it progressed from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s through. It became a lot easier to jump your class, to change your income bracket, and to change where you are. It's easier to build generational wealth. It's easier to send your kids to college. It's easier to do all these things, and it's easier to see the clear steps. It's very clear. Boom, 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 boom. Well, if you're in one of these class distinctions where it's a struggle, in a struggle you have to be set in your size, your teams. You're either rich or you're poor, and the poor people are trying to be rich, and the rich people are trying to not be poor, and they're just trying to stay separate. Well, in the U.S., I feel like there's a gradient, and you're just trying to move up the ladder. You're just trying to be better,
Well,
and I feel like that kind of meritorious based system is far superior.
and only market economies can do that. And this is, and I think you'll probably agree with me on this, although feel free to disagree. This is why it drives me so insane. I would encounter leftist after leftist after leftist at Pepperdine and at Biola, where I transferred from, and they would say, oh well, we're not saying that we should be communist or that we should be like radical revolutionary socialist. All we're saying is that America should be like Norway or Sweden or Denmark. And what drives me insane about that is that they don't realize that the Scandinavian countries actually have very strong, very robust market economies, like to some extent even more so than the U.S. And they don't. There's a few critical factors they don't realize here. Is first of all, those countries have very small populations. Their populations are compared to the U.S. are very ethnically homogenous, ethnically and
Extremely,
linguistically and
extremely.
culturally
I've
homogenous.
been
they have incredibly rich natural resources, in comparison, per capita, in comparison to their population. And the other critical component that I've never heard any leftist mention to me ever is that those countries are able to maintain a very strong welfare state, that provides high quality public health care, high quality public education and transportation, all that stuff, housing, food services. They're able to do that because most of their military defense is provided by the U.S. and NATO. They're under that NATO and U.S. provided protective net, so they spend very little of their national budgets on defense every year. They don't even meet their NATO obligations in a lot of cases. So they're able to divert all of those public monies into their welfare state. So that means that the quality of their welfare state is going to be relatively high. We can't replicate such a system here in the States for those structural reasons, because no one's going to be covering our defense except us. So,
well, I feel like that's something that kind of goes as an overarching thing. Since the dawn of time, there's been somebody who has something and somebody who wants to take it. And in the U.S. case, we have a lot of freedoms, and there's a lot of people who want to take those freedoms and want to control us, and that's why traditionally we've always had a pretty robust military and pretty robust defense spending and a pretty robust military culture. And I also feel like one of the things that is also overlooked with these Scandinavian countries, I've been to Denmark, is that it's very small. The cities are small. The countries are very small. The populations are small, and the incomes and everything else are fairly high. So it's very easy to say, oh, well, if we take 20% of your income, or 30%, 40%, or however much, we're taking 40% of a lot of a few people, and we're putting it into these big welfare programs, healthcare, various other things.
Yep.
And it becomes pretty evident that it's like, well, of course it's going to work, because you only have such a small portion that's actually going to use it. If you look at just the number of sick people in Denmark compared to the number of sick people in the U.S., it's not even comparable. I mean, Denmark's like what, the size of New York, maybe, not even the size of Texas, that's for sure. So it's like, how can this work on such a large scale? I would say that there are some things that I do like about us. Some of those Nordic countries. I believe Norway has the retirement fund as just a total investment account, and I do think that is kind of nice. I do think that is kind of smart, and I do kind of like that. But it also comes with some risk, and it also comes with a certain kind of uncomfortability of the government, investing and intervening and all that. And that becomes very, very dangerous to give your retirement money to an entity like that is not looking out for you, which is why I don't think it would work in the States at all. There's a lot of things, because you got to realize the U.S. is so individualistic. It's founded on the individual. Yes. It's founded on that Ayn Rand philosophy that just,
and John Locke.
Locke too, and that kind of Kant and Rousseau and all that. And everything that kind of makes up that whole school of thought, that makes it very, very, very difficult. And I think that also comes down to how different the U.S. is. I'm very different from everyone else, and everybody else is very different from me. Well, if you go to Denmark, it's like, so what?
Yes,
they're all very similar, and you start looking at them, you're like, huh.
And I think because of that, too, and a lot of this comes down to ethnic homogeneity, is Denmark is what anthropologists and sociologists would describe as a very high-trust society. Their population, I think, is only around 2 million, and the vast majority of them, until very, very recently, were all ethnic Danes. Whose families had lived there for, in some cases, thousands of years. And so here in the U.S., we're a relatively new society. We're also very, one of the most ethnically diverse societies in history, which is okay. Like, there's nothing, inherently wrong with that. But it does come with certain challenges. Like, each model is going to come with different structural problems and challenges. And one of the problems that you're going to encounter in any society that's very diverse in any way is you're going to have less social trust. And so it's very very difficult to maintain, a functioning welfare state in a society where you have such inherent low trust. And this is what drives me crazy about the cultural Marxist, wokey, far left types, is they're always screaming diversity, equity, and inclusion, but they're not recognizing the fact that diversity isn't always a strength. That it's not inherently bad, but it has to be managed, because if we have a very diverse society and we're constantly emphasizing how we're different, and we're constantly telling people to be as different as possible all the time in every public space, emphasize their racial difference, their ethnic difference, their linguistic difference, their religious difference, their sexual orientation difference, their gender identity difference, it's going to create conflict. So what we need to do is, instead, we need to emphasize what we have in common. And I think number one in doing that is to make sure that we promote English as the common language for everyone. We really stress that it's very important in public life to use English exclusively wherever possible. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I would feel like that's certainly a great point, and I feel like that's something that's a little bit lost now as norms have changed. When my ancestors immigrated here, that they completely gave up on Italian.
Mm-hmm.
The first generation that came over spoke it, and they said after that, you're learning English, you're American, that's it, you're done.
Yep.
And that's how I believe it is, and that's certainly something that I believe is worth pursuing, and certainly something that's important. I think the identity of an American is something that's lost now more than ever, as you start to decide your ethnic lines, your diversity lines, if you would. The moment that you start cutting yourself down into these more individual boxes, you can say, "Oh, well, I'm Irish and Italian. I'm not American." But that's when you really start to lose it, and that's when things start to go downhill pretty quick, and that's something that's very upsetting when you're looking at extremism on campus, and you're like, wait, we're all Americans here. We all have the same rights. We're all equal, and that's all set down. But I don't think that many people really believe that anymore.
Well, yes, and it's incredible to me how like I just mentioned, we have diversity, equity, and inclusion emphasized all the time, particularly in our media and on university campuses. But these days, what they're asking us to include is often some real clown world stuff. Like we have a situation where I remember in the class we took together with a professor who shall remain unnamed. We were shown a video presentation of Sam Brinton, who was an official in the Biden regime and who has since been fired, due to being charged with multiple felonies, grand larceny for stealing other people's luxury clothes from their luggage at airports, as you know. But this professor played a video of him. I'm going to say him because it is a biological male, although he insists on they, them, which, that's part of this conversation. But, this professor was saying that we have a duty to call someone by their preferred pronouns, and that we're not inclusive and we're not tolerant unless we do that. And I just want to know, whatever happened to the common sense duty of people to present themselves in the way that they want to be perceived? When you go to a job interview, you dress professionally because you want to be perceived as a professional. So if Sam Brinton wants to be perceived as a they, them, then he needs to present in such a way that will cause other people to readily perceive him that way. And until he does, I'm not going to play the stupid game. And I want to know what your thoughts on that whole situation was.
Well, I feel like that is very indicative of a conflict, a very big structural conflict, and I believe that conflict is a conflict of two individuals, and that's extremely hard to reckon with within the American view, because you have two individual ideas. I'm going to call you what I want to call you, and I want to be called what I want to be called. And those two, there's no overlap. There's no overlap on this. They're separate. I'm either going to call you what I want to call you, and you're going to be called what you want to be called. Those two freedoms don't intersect. There's no forcing me to call you what you want to be called, and there's no me forcing you to be called what I want to call you. So I feel like that's kind of why this conflict is ongoing, and it won't be resolved. And I don't think it ever will be resolved, because you either force them to be called what you want to call them, or you're forced to call them what they want to be called. And either way, you're stepping on a perceived individual liberty.
It's compelled
And
speech.
you can't have both. You can have one or you can have the other, but
Right.
you can't have both freedoms. And I feel like until that's reconciled, and I believe it is very clearly reconciled within the First Amendment,
Yes.
very clearly, in my opinion. But once again, that's just how I feel. Um, until that's settled, it's gonna keep popping up, and that's kind of an issue. And with all that, I feel like um, that there is kind of a middle ground where it could be a lot easier if they did present a certain way, and if you did kind of dress yourself how you want to be dressed and addressed. You know, if I go to a nice restaurant, I try to put on a dress shirt. I try to look nice. I try to look
Right.
like the clientele that would go to such a place.
Or a
And,
nightclub, or yeah.
go to a nightclub, or, wherever, whatever I'm doing, I try to make sure that I look the part. If I'm going to a rough part of town, I make sure that I'm not, flashing, bling all over the
No.
place and gonna get mugged.
Yeah, that's
That's
right.
just common sense. It's very easy, and it's another kind of individual liberty, I believe, that's also a little lost on the nuance of, because I feel like you have the liberty to dress how you and appear however you want, for better or worse, you know. But like this Hawaiian shirt, I want it to look like I'm here for a good time. I want to be
Yeah.
having a nice casual conversation, just catching up with my friend.
A big
So
luau.
I
Yep.
felt like Hawaiian shirt fit the vibe.
Yes.
I felt like it was appropriate. But also, I could have, put on anything else, and that would either be perceived as inappropriate or, appropriate. But I feel like a lot of that is kind of cultural. The reason why you don't, show up to a nice restaurant in a t-shirt is because you won't get served, and the restaurant will kick you out, and they'll laugh at you. They'll make fun of you. Society will put the pressure on you. And I feel like within that, keeping the individual liberties curtailed and conformed to a manageable level is a pressure that is on society. Society is the one that pushes you to not go out naked along with
Right.
the law,
Yeah.
but that law is from society.
Yes.
That's very clearly a constraint, and I feel like certain other things like that can fall into that category as well. And I feel like there's another thing in that too of perceived like class that's kind of lost. I feel like a lot of people don't want to appear nice. At least this is what I found walking around campus as one of the more finer dressed guys. I like to wear slacks. I like to wear dress shirts. I like to appear like a smart student. And I find like I do feel smarter when I dress smart.
Yes.
And you know what they say, the clothes make the man. I'm a firm believer in that. And I feel like that's another thing that's kind of lost within the individual freedom, and something that I feel like there should be some more pressure on.
Yep.
And I feel like that would certainly kind of bring in a little bit of this kind of questioning, this kind of confusion within society, because you can see whenever you see somebody who's different from you walk in somewhere very clearly different, and you're like, oh man, they make an impression, and first impressions are everything. And I feel like that kind of signaling to each other is very very important to the culture right now. Very important, that dog whistling for both sides.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's something that should kind of relax. It should go away. I mean, you should be kind of more constrained, kind of more thinking about it, more conscious of your actions and how you're perceived, and accept the consequences.
Yes.
I don't get mad if I get turned away from a nice restaurant and I look like a bum.
Right.
If I look like a bum and I get hassled on the street, or I get turned away from a restaurant, or something like that happens, I'm not mad. I'm not like, oh man, they don't want to serve me. What's going on? It's like, yeah, I don't look good. They don't want to serve me. That's fine. That's their prerogative. Let's say.
Oh yeah,
That's my cat.
absolutely no, it's
Sorry
quite
about
right.
that.
But the other angle of this that's really disturbing too is typically, in environments like this that are cultural Marxist dominated, they attempt to impose requirements on us that we deny objective truth and objective facts, which I think is one of the most dangerous totalitarian tendencies we're seeing from the Western left today. Like for example, in this same course. There was another instance in which we were told that in that class we were not permitted to use the term illegal immigrant as though it were a slur. Now, illegal immigrant is not a slur. It's an objective descriptor of a fact. And, I just want to say, like, as an anti-statist, in principle, I don't even support, state-imposed immigration laws. But to say that someone who's in the country illegally is an illegal immigrant is an objective fact. It's just like I'm very pro-gun rights. I'm very anti-gun control. But, if somebody owns a firearm that is in violation of the National Firearms Act, or in California in violation of, like, the California State Assault Weapons Ban, within a technical sense, it's an illegal firearm. So I don't think it should be illegal, but it is. And so I'm not directing a slur against that person because I say, okay, well, that's an illegal firearm. So the fact that we're required to, when we speak about certain things, to almost deny facts or not address it entirely is really disturbing. And, if you could just talk briefly about some of the experiences you may or may not have had with that on campus.
Of course. I feel like one of the best ways to demonstrate this. I'll restart that. Come on, Lopa.
Yeah.
Sorry, I do apologize.
No, it's quite all right. He's a cute cat.
Yeah. She's adorable. I don't know why she's bothering me, but anyway, yeah, I feel like one of the best examples of this and best kind of ways to illustrate it is to look at 1984. One of the key principles in there is 2 + 2 = 5.
Yeah.
And when the state says that and it becomes true, this is a major point throughout the book, and it's that denial of truth, reason, common sense, definitions, and I feel like that's a great way to demonstrate kind of what's going on some levels with a lot of this forced language and this forced kind of redefining of facts and kind of blurring them. Facts are facts. I'm a guy. That's a fact. The shirt's blue. That's a fact. I'm hungry. That's a fact. There you go. You can't really change them. 2 + 2 = 4 doesn't really care about your feelings and doesn't care how you say it. And that's just kind of how it is. And I think like anytime that you start to deviate from truth, fact, reason, logic, you start to stray into very dangerous territory because there's no anchor. You're just adrift, mentally, politically, however you want to say it. As soon as you let go of a fact or a basis of fact or basis of truth, forget about it. It's over. If I tell you, oh, it's raining outside and it isn't, you're gonna call me out on that. You're gonna say, oh, Logan, it's not raining outside. You're crazy. And it could be, if I tell you it's raining outside, it isn't, and then by all means, I'm crazy. And then you can say, well, then, you shouldn't be doing this or you should be doing that. And I feel like that kind of blurring of, well, maybe you could see it is raining. Maybe if you've got some kind of, if you're crying or something and you see rain, it could be raining. Or if you turn on a sprinkler and you start, waving the water around, you can say, oh, it's raining. But it isn't. It isn't raining. It's not the objective fact.
Or worse yet, if you were to say it is raining even though it's not, and you're a bigot if you so much as dare to even attempt to broach the topic of pointing that out. And what's dangerous about all this is a lot of times with these attempts at compelled speech, the force of the state is often behind this, and that is always the beginning of a slide toward authoritarianism and totalitarianism.
Yeah, and that's very dangerous, and that's something that I think everybody wants to avoid on some level. Everybody wants to avoid that, state control, that state mandated. Anytime that you have something like that going on, it's very bad. I mean, look at Saddam Hussein. One of the biggest stories is, he was like, oh, does anybody oppose me? And the people raise their hands and they have them shot and killed.
Yeah.
It's over. Done.
Yep.
And, when you start getting into those kind of realms and you start getting into, well, you can't tell them, you can't say that. And then you go, well, all right, well, what'll happen? Oh, well, you'll get fined. Okay, that's fine. And then you say, oh, you say it again. You can't say that. What's going to happen? Oh, you get put in jail. Oh, well, that's not good. But it's only a couple days. Okay, whatever. It's a misdemeanor. No, you can't say that. Now it's a felony. Now you're getting killed for it.
Yep.
And it's just like that. And anytime that you give an inch, you can't really take it back. It's very hard to take something back. It's like you give a gift. It's very hard to take that gift back. I certainly know that with a few girlfriends, but
Yes.
that's a different story. But that's just how it is. That's why it's very hard to want to give up rights. It's very hard to want to be compelled to speech, and it's a reason why you have to make a stand on very, very small issues.
It is.
The molehill becomes the mountain in a moment.
Sometimes very quickly, as we saw with Mao's Cultural Revolution, and that's why it's so incredibly important to even do what we're doing now on the show, even though it might seem like a small thing, because we are speaking the truth, we are daring to speak it, and the more people do that, especially en masse, that in and of itself will act as a social and cultural force to push back against cultural Marxist lies and totalitarianism. And Jordan Peterson once said, "There's nothing more powerful in the universe than one man speaking the truth." And that's he's a man I greatly admire, and that's one of his many brilliant quotes that I very much agree with. But with that, I want to say, Mr. Logan Gulev, thank you so much for coming on, and giving all of your these profound contributions to the issues that confront us here in the United States today. And we look forward to having you on again sometime. This has been yet another episode of CA Propcast. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and we always appreciate your time. And until next time, as they say in the Commonwealth of Virginia, sic semper tyrannis.